My name is Jared, and I get the privilege of serving as the pastor here at Friends Church, and so excited that you joined us. We're going to get into our scripture for today, but before we do, I just wanted to go ahead and show you a picture of a building that I recently found out about. And if we have that picture up, no, Mark, that's your cue. Oh man, Mark's not back there. Oh, we got it. Thank you, Scott. So this, I don't know if you know what this is. This is the Millennium Tower. This is in San Francisco. I believe it's like the 6th tallest building in San Francisco, and it is the number 1 largest residential building there, which is really interesting. So this project, I was searching a little bit about it, and it was actually a $600 million project in 2009. And it's the largest, I already said that, largest residential building. It's 58 stories tall, to give you an idea of how big this is. The penthouse in this building sold for $13 million. But it was built in 2009. In 2015, they uncovered that it was actually on top of a soft foundation and had been sinking into the ground. It is now found to be leaning over about 22 inches from where it's supposed to be perpendicularly. And so in 2018, residents started reporting calls that they were seeing cracks in the glass of their windows. Could you imagine being in that building as you hear these cracks and these rumblings throughout the night where the building is literally shifting? And in March of 2023, there were reports of calls to the fire department where panes of glass were literally falling off of the building. Could you imagine? So here you have this death trap that was sold to residents in 2009, and now they have a $100 million project in which they need to re-level this building. And so they got the funds through some lawsuits for $100 million, but the cost ended up coming up to $120 million. So what they're doing now is they're actually taxing the residents who they're putting a special assessment on the residents who purchase units in this building and are making them pay for the cost. Could you imagine being sold a death trap and now you have to pay even more money just to make it livable? Catastrophic, isn't it? But this isn't the only building that has a shifting foundation. Unfortunately, this is actually a problem that happens more often than not. And there is, not more often than not, but more often than we would like. And so here's a picture of another one that's more famously known for its leaning, right? This tower was also built on a shifting foundation. And they found out while they were building it that it was shifting and falling down because it was built on a soft surface. And we have one more building. This one was in 2021. This building built in Florida, these towers, these condos, they were built, and because of the unsolid foundation, they shifted, and it turned catastrophic, killing, unfortunately, 98 people who were living in that building. And so you can see how a bad foundation can lead to catastrophic consequences, can't it? And as we think about these buildings, we see how essential it is for a building to be built on a truly solid foundation. However, as Jesus comes to the close of this Sermon on the Mount in which we have been studying, he is going to emphasize the importance of building our lives on such a solid foundation. And so today I want to ask you, what kind of foundation is your life built on? Is your foundation one that is going to stand through the test of times? Is it going to stand up through the long haul? Or is it on soft ground? And is it going to lead you to catastrophic consequences later on in life? Today, we are finishing up our Kingdom Come series. We've been taking an in-depth look at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Last week, we explored prayer. And Jesus, through that, he taught his disciples about the goodness of God. He compared God to the likeness of a good father who wants to give good gifts to his children. We learn that God does not let his children go unnoticed. He answers everything and everyone who seeks him. And so today we're going to continue studying Jesus' words in his sermon, and we're going to see that his teaching moves from being about God more towards a warning towards his disciples, where he's going to teach them that the life that they start to embark on, it's actually going to be one that costs them dearly. And Jesus warns his hearers in his passage today that there comes a cost to following him, to following his words, to following his teachings that he's been giving so far in his sermon. And he makes it clear in this message that his hearers, they have to come to a decision, whether they're going to choose to follow him or not. He makes it clear in his final discourse that a decision needs to be made. His hearers have to make a choice. Are they going to pledge allegiance to Jesus and his instructions, or are they going to pledge their allegiance to the righteousness and the religious establishment that existed in this time period? So Jesus is essentially saying, you are either going to be for me or you are going to be against me. There's no way around it. His hearers must make a decision. So as we go through our text today, Jesus is going to illuminate for us 3 different ways in which his hearers would prefer to reject his teachings outright altogether. And the first way is because many people will opt out of following Jesus because it's unpopular. And the second way many people want to opt out of following Jesus is because other things look more attractive. And the third way people are going to want to opt out from following Jesus is because it's more convenient and less is required of them. So our text today is in the book of Matthew in chapter 7. We're going to be starting reading at verse 13. So I invite you, if you brought a Bible, go ahead and grab it and flip along. I would tell you that the verses are going to be on the screen, but I'm not sure if we'll get there. Oh, hey, look at that. Good job, Mark. Thanks for filling in this morning. All right, well, let's go ahead and read it. Starting in verse 13. You can follow along with me. It says this: Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. We're going to go ahead and pause right there. Jesus begins this section talking about narrow and wide gates. Jesus is talking metaphorically here, not literal gates. But the imagery he is using around this wide gate is to picture a life that evokes a sense of ease and a sense of comfort, right? You can see the cushy ways. It's kind of like driving on the highway. If you're in real narrow lines, you don't feel that. But if you're in nice wide lanes or nice big areas, it feels really comfortable, really easy to drive along now, doesn't it? So he talks about this wide gate, and this is referring to a worldly lifestyle, a lifestyle that's synonymous with the surrounding culture. Jesus says this is the way of life that is a wide gate. It doesn't mean a life without any difficulties, but it is a life in which the majority are living in. And it's the physical world around us, the things that you can control, provide you a sort of ease and comfort. But on the other hand, Jesus talks about another gate, and this is the narrow gate. And the image of a narrow gate is supposed to evoke in you this difficulty, this uncomfortable way of living. And in verse 13, Jesus, he urges his hearers to take one road over the other. He advocates that they take the narrow road, and he gives a reason for this as he explains. This road, it's the less popular gate, less popular road, but it's the one that truly leads to life. Jesus continues in this verse, he says, but only a few find this narrow road. This doesn't mean that no one can find it, but it does mean those who choose to take it are going to be less than those who choose the way of ease and comfort. But for those who choose the narrow road, he's not saying your life will always be difficult, but rather he is saying you will be going against the unpopular opinions, the way of life in which the majority are choosing to take. And this may well lead you to experiencing oppression and even persecution from those who decide to take the wide gate. Often, when this passage is explained, you may have heard it understood as the gates at the end of the road. And you take this road, and if you follow the narrow road, you'll eventually get to the gate that leads to life. But if you notice, as we read this together, Jesus didn't start with the road, he starts with the gate. And he says, those who choose to enter the gate of following my way, they will continue up that road, but it's the gate that leads towards everlasting life. And so you can see how Jesus now is funneling this to his disciples, saying, you need to make a decision right here and right now. It's not your good way of living. It's not your works righteousness that get to get you into heaven. You need to make a choice right now to accept me and my teachings. Jesus makes it clear it's that only through him, he is the gate in which leads towards entrance into the kingdom of heaven. And it must come with acceptance of his words and his teachings. So when we are motivated by a desire where I'm going to go with this is when I think I have the wrong notes up here. That's why. Okay. Woo, let me pick this back up. Sorry, my kids were playing with my tablet. Here we go. In the world in which I got the right ones now. In the world in which we live in today, we battle this temptation to follow the popular opinions and popular trends, don't we? Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt this? And we have to wrestle with this constantly, especially if you have already chosen the way of Christ and to follow his teachings. And some of you have probably experienced this and sometimes experienced this on a daily level. And I'll give you a really easy example. You guys decided to come to church today, but very likely there's something else going on that you could have been a part of. Oftentimes people come to this decision, are they going to watch football at home or are they going to come to church? And these are kind of what we're battling constantly, because maybe you work in a place where your boss is all about the game. And so if you miss the game and you don't get to tell them about it on Monday and join in that conversation with your coworkers, you're going to feel like you're missing out on something. But is that sacrifice worth it to you because of what you believe in and who you choose to follow? Or are you going to take the way of popularity and ease? Another way that this creeps into your lifestyle and the way in which you live is with political stances as well. Are you going to follow the ones that are more popular, in which you're going to choose to follow the road in which everyone is going, or are you going to stand up for the beliefs in which Jesus tells us to stand up for? These are the sorts of things that we have to battle with today, just like they did back there in the ancient culture. But what is your motivation? What is the underlying principle that is having you step forward? Because if it is a desire to please the people around you, to be involved within the political opinions, that's building your life on a shaky foundation. But instead, if you want to find true life, it should be one that is reflecting Jesus' teachings in every avenue of your life. And I want to go ahead and take a moment to just acknowledge that this is often much harder for those who make a decision to follow Christ later in life. Because oftentimes that requires you to sacrifice some of the relationships that you've had before. Not that you have to get rid of them, but you're going to face some opposition. You're going to face some persecution because you're changing your belief system, and it's not as popular as the mainstream understanding. As maybe those thoughts that go on in your friend circle, as the thoughts that go on with your coworkers. And you're going to have to push against that sort of resistance. And this is why Jesus says entering through that narrow gate leads to a more difficult road. Because we have to wrestle with this. And so are these things keeping you from experiencing the life that he wants? Are you not willing to suffer those losses and the unpopular, those austere looks? Are you not willing to handle the criticism? Remember that narrow gate is the way to life. And Jesus doesn't say that narrow gate means you're going to avoid difficulty altogether, but he does tell us later in the gospel that he will be with you when you face those difficulties and when you face that persecution. He's walking right alongside you. In Matthew, just a couple chapters later, in chapter 11, verse 20, he gives us reassurance that when you take on his yoke and you bind yourself to him, his yoke is easy and its burden is light. He provides us with comfort and he walks with those who choose to follow him, and he will be with you through even those difficult times. And so even though Jesus will be with you, he still needs his hearers to understand the cost that is required of those who choose to follow him. So let's continue on in our passage, picking up the text in verse 15. And Jesus reveals another reason which people often opt out of choosing to follow him. And that's because other things look more attractive. So the text in verse 15, it says this: "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and is thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evil doers.'" That's a lot for us to unpack. Let's go back up to the top in verse 15. Jesus begins in verse 15 by warning his followers to look out for false prophets. Those false prophets who might come in their way. He describes them as ferocious wolves who are coming in sheep's clothing. And he gives his hearers insights into how they can now begin to identify these false prophets when they come. And he says, you will be able to recognize them by the fruit in which they produce. Then he asks them a question. In verse 16, he says, do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Now, if you're sitting in the room and you're anything like me, you have no idea what the answer to this question is, do you? I've never picked grapes. I've never picked figs. So maybe they do grow on thorn bushes. Maybe they do grow on thistles. I have no clue. But to understand this passage, we need to enter ourselves into the mindset of the people he is talking to. Back in the first century, they were an agrarian society. They lived off of these fruits, especially in the region in which they were living in. Grapes and figs, they were a source of life to them. And no, they were not grown on thorn bushes or thistles, right? He was doing a little rhetorical question there. It's pretty blatantly obvious if you're picking these fruits. But basically, grapes and figs were their source of life, where thorn bushes and thistles, they were cumbersome. If you walked through them, you would get cut and you would get hurt. You have to watch out for them. And especially if you're growing your crops that are grapes and are figs, if thistles and thorn bushes start making their way into where you're cultivating the soil, they will take the rich nutrients from them so that your fruits cannot grow well. And so you can see this idea that Jesus is getting at of these false prophets. If they make their way into this, they can really take from what is good, and their intentions are evil. So understanding this context, it helps us grasp the richness and the depths of Jesus' teaching in this section. In verse 7, Jesus continues to unpack this fruit metaphor. And he says that the reason we can spot false prophets is by the fruit, because good trees only bear good fruit, but bad trees, they will only bear bad fruit. In other words, a false prophet who has evil intentions, they won't produce anything good. They will claim to speak on behalf of God when in fact they did not. That is what it means to be a false prophet. And so this imagery of fruit, this imagery of wolves and sheep, it's very powerful. And Jesus is explaining that false prophets, they may feel like they are genuine members of God's flock, when in reality they are not. They may have the talk and the association with a group that looks like they are genuine members of God. They might make you feel good or like they belong to God, but internally they're motivated by selfishness. Their intentions are only selfish. Just like a wolf in sheep's clothing, they may look like they belong in the herd, but eventually their greed, their selfishness, their gluttony, their ferocity, their evil intentions, it will eventually show through. They care nothing for anyone else other than themselves. All they care about is satisfying their own gluttony and their own greed. It's not about what they can give to the rest of the flock. It's only about what they can get from them. Because wolves, they'll never die for their sheep. You can see that to Jesus, the fruit of one's life, they are vital and they are essential, because it reveals what is at the core of that person. Just here, he's warning his disciples not to fall into the trap of listening to someone who is speaking falsely of God in an attempt to lead them astray. Be vigilant, be on guard for these people, and you will know them by the fruit that comes from their lives. And Jesus continues. He starts to unpack a little bit more about how difficult this can be sometimes. And in verse 21, he says that not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. And so to provide you a little bit of clarification, when Jesus uses the word Lord here, he's using it as a common title, not as a divine title, because Jesus has not yet fully realized his plan, his purpose, his divinity at this point yet. And so when he's talking about those people professing Lord, Lord, he's not talking about an expression or a profession of faith. He's using this word just as a term of politeness, as if they were their teacher or master. And then, so that's just a little bit of clarification. These people are not professing faith. And in verse 2, he talks about these people, and what they do is they prophesy, they drive out demons, and they perform miracles. And yet in verse 23, Jesus' reaction is, "Away from me, you evil doers." And so at first glance, this might drive you a little bit nuts, because my reaction at first, if I were to see someone prophesying, driving out demons, or performing miracles, initially I would think to myself, they must be sent from God. But Jesus' response isn't that. His response is, "Away from me, you evildoer, I never knew you." And so in our minds, we might say, how can this be? There's a bit of a disconnect here. But what Jesus is teaching us is a valuable principle that we need to understand. Because Jesus is showing us an example of the attractiveness of these false prophets. Outwardly, they look really good. They look like they are straight from God. But we need to look deeper into their intentions, and it's that fruit that we must find. In this case, Jesus sees that their intentions with the miracles are purely self-glorification. They're not the good things that he's been talking about so far in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those who are merciful, and those types of things he has been expressing. So it's important to note that Jesus, in his ministry, he never says that you will know my disciples by the miracles that they do. He never says that. But rather, he says you will know my disciples by their hearts and by their good deeds and the good works that they produce. So it's those who do the will of the fathers. Those are the ones who truly enter the kingdom of heaven. And so for us today, we need to be really mindful of not letting lavish displays of religiosity fool us. Lavish, showy displays of religiosity, they're not the criteria in which we should use to evaluate the truth of someone's message or to see if they're truly sent and belong to God. He demands an inward allegiance to God's will, and that will produce the fruit of a truly changed life. And in our culture, we wrestle with this all the time. We are flooded with these kinds of false prophets that try and steer you away into a different way of living than the one in which Jesus is advocating for. Our world thrives off of flashiness, these outward displays, doesn't it? So it's easy for us to be tempted and fall into these traps, to be caught up with them, especially within the church. Because inwardly, we have this desire to see this fame, to watch the miraculous. And it can often lead us to losing sight of the things that truly matter. The heart behind those good deeds of obedience that often get lost on us. And one of the obvious ways we see this on display is with the emergence of the prosperity gospel. And this prosperity gospel, it tells us that it tells people that God wants you to be richly blessed in this life. He wants you to be physically well and to be material rich. And that is a proof that God is faithful. But this prosperity gospel is based on the idea that your faith can bring you health, that your faith can bring you wealth, and your faith can bring you happiness. And oftentimes the preachers at these churches, they ask their congregants to give heavily, to tell them when they do, they will be blessed because of their gifts. And you can see how underlying there might be this wolf in sheep's clothing that is telling people that they will get physical blessings if they give things to them. You can see a little bit of that selfish motivation coming in right there. So we need to be careful when these things become really popular, especially in today's day and age. We need to start looking for the good fruits that are coming. Because yes, God does want to bless you, but oftentimes he knows what is best for you. Sometimes it's not physical healing. Sometimes it's not financial success. Sometimes it's not fame and fortune. It can look very different, but God knows what is best. Sometimes he puts you in a difficult circumstance to train you and to build your character. So it doesn't always have to be health, wealth, prosperity. But people are easily trapped into this idea, especially those who are from poorer circumstances. They can jump into this and really be preyed on by these wolves. So I agree, God does want to give us joy, a lasting and true happiness. But it's a fruit of the Spirit. And there's nowhere in the Bible where it promotes this through a means of wealth. This giving in order to receive idea, it attracts many people because they ignore the directness of Jesus' teaching that depicts a life of difficulty for those who choose to follow him. Jesus now, he warns his hearers against dramatic displays of spiritual power, and he warns them that these signs are not necessarily proof of their validity. They're not proof that they are done in line with the Father's will. They can actually come from sources other than God himself. And so you can see that many people, they opt out of following Jesus because other things can look more attractive. And so for us today, what do we do with this? Well, I believe we need to get our hearts right with God and make sure our motivations are pure and well-intended. So it takes a moment for reflection to evaluate your own life and think about the fruit in which you are producing. Are you displaying outwardly obedience with God's words? Are you truly displaying the fruits of the Spirit, like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? Are those what mark your life, or are other things what mark your life? Is your life marked by greed and selfishness, what you can get from other people, or by being a blessing to those whom God places around you? Because that's what the true life of a disciple looks like. It's not necessarily flashy, and it may not be prominent, it may not be boisterous or loud, but that is the evidence of a life of someone who truly belongs to the Father. So Jesus offers one final warning, and we're going to move into this one. And this final warning is that many people opt out of following Jesus because it requires too much effort. So let's jump into verse 24 and read his words here. It says this: "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rains came, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law." So we hear Jesus in these verses giving a final appeal to his hearers. In verse 24, he says that those who hear these words and put them into practice are the ones who choose to build their life on a solid foundation. Most of us in the room probably did not construct the house in which we are living in. So this idea of a foundation and laying it on a solid rock, it may not be that tangible for us. But in Jesus' day, people had a pretty good understanding of what he is talking about, and especially because of the region in which they lived in. In the context of Galilee, it's surrounded by a large body of water. And so they have some beach fronts up there. And in the summer, the thing about these sandy shores is in the summer, they would actually get compacted by the heat, and they would actually feel pretty firm and pretty hard, like something you might want to build a structure on. But while it feels solid in that season, when the climate begins to change, it will not be strong enough, and eventually the house you build on it will collapse. And so most people in this region, they've experienced the climate change. They know what happens to that sand. So the wiser, more experienced builders, they know that if they want to build a structure that will last and endure the changes that come in seasons, they need to dig beneath that sandy surface, often upwards, digging down to as large as 10 feet below the surface to expose the true solid foundation in which they could build their house on. So Jesus' audience, they understood how foolish it would be to go out onto the sands in the summertime and to build a structure, because it will not last very long. And Jesus uses this example to call his hearers to a point of decision making. Because the shallow, the sandy, the unstable foundation, he is referencing to someone who builds their life on those religious leaders of the day, the religious establishment that existed back then. If you build your life on these words, that's a really shaky foundation. But if you choose to build your life on Jesus' words, the teaching in which he's been giving so far, you will be making a good decision, and you will be building on a firm foundation. So he's asking his hearers he's asking them this question: will they choose to reject the shallow, shifting sand of these religious leaders and instead choose Jesus' words as the foundation in which they're going to build their lives on? Are they going to be for him or are they going to be against him? And so in this section of Scripture, we get a glimpse into the profound truth into which the kingdom of Jesus, it operates. And the truth is that Jesus' kingdom, in his kingdom, it's often the right things that are the much harder things. Because how much easier would it be to build a house on the sandy foundation? You just plop a couple things in there, build your foundation, and you're done. Would you rather dig 10 feet down into the ground in order to establish your foundation? That sounds a lot harder, doesn't it? Sounds like a lot more work, doesn't it? But what we learn from this passage is that even though it requires more effort from you, if you want a life that is going to withstand climate change and the pressures that come with life and the different seasons that you enter into, you need to spend the time to dig down and build on that solid foundation. Because that is what it looks like to be wise men and women who build their lives on Jesus. So that you can have a life that is full and a life that is thriving regardless of the cultural or religious weather that comes around you. In the world in which we are living in, there are often different foundations in which we find people building their lives on. You can build your life on career success, how well you do in your job, how high you get in your organization. You can build your life on that. You can also attempt to build your life on relationships, or the spouse that you accrue, or the family that you build. You can try and build your life on that. You can also try and build your life on wealth and possessions, the things that you can amass unto yourself. You can try and build your life on that. How about on your personal identity? What about your philosophical ideas? How about your own happiness and pleasure, the things you can experience, the substance you can get a hold of, the entertainment you can set your eyes on? You can try all of these different things to build your life on, but all of these are shifting sands. They are things that will not last. They may stand up for a season, but they will inevitably get knocked down when life starts to happen and seasons begin to change. But there is one solid rock that has been proven for centuries over and over and over again. That's why we're still reading out of this book today and applying the principles that we find in it. It's because Jesus' words are a truly solid foundation on which you can build your life on. And it may not be easy. It may require sacrifice. It may require you to go outside of yourself and rely on other people. It may be difficult, but that is the only foundation that is truly going to last. It's the only foundation that has truly stood the test of time and is still true today. 2,000 years later, Jesus' words remain the same. They are a firm foundation. But despite the lasting truths of his words, we still encounter many people going astray from this, thinking that they can find something else to add to Jesus in which to build their lives on. Maybe I can have a little bit of Jesus and I can also include my social framework. Maybe I can also include my happiness, my pleasure. Maybe I can also include my wealth and my possessions, and I can go with it all together. And we're entering into this season in our culture of religious pluralism, where if you can amass all these things, maybe I will finally be able to build my foundation. But Jesus says you can't do that if you choose to follow him. In John 14:6, he makes it very clear, saying, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. There is one gate, and it is narrow. We cannot build our lives on anything other or anything additional in order to get there, only upon Jesus Christ. So you can see Jesus is calling his readers to now make a decision. Are you going to believe in me and follow my ways? Or are you going to build your life on something else? And so I want to ask you who are sitting in this room today, will you make that choice? Will you choose to build your life on him and his words, the only thing that will last? Are you going to choose to pledge your allegiance to him despite the costs that may come with it? We've talked a lot about all the different reasons that many choose to opt out of following Jesus, but I want to finish by talking just about these last couple of verses that are included in this section. Verses 28 and 29, they say this: when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teachings, because he taught as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law. And so we can see, how did the crowds react to his teaching? After saying all these things, what did they do? They looked up with amazement. They responded with amazement. Wow, this is awesome. This is very cool. But there's a big difference between amazement and acceptance. And I want to make that really clear right now. There's a big difference between amazement and acceptance. You can get caught up with all the things he's saying. Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? That'd be so cool. But to truly accept it is the decision in which Jesus is getting to. Are you going to be amazed by it, but walk away and find something else you can be amazed by? That's shifting sand. Or are you going to accept my teachings after this amazement? What are you going to do with it? There is decision for anyone in the room who is reading this with us today. Because what the majority of that crowd did is they failed to take that next step because it required too much work. They failed to continue moving into what Jesus said and apply it to their lives and accept that way of living. And they walked away to find another shifting sand to try and build their lives on. This is why it's much easier for us to often respond with amazement. Wow, isn't that amazing? Isn't that cool? Somebody should do that one day. But fail to take that next step into acceptance and that calling in which God places on your life. But it's only through acceptance of Jesus' invitation from which someone can enter into the kingdom of heaven. Amazement alone will never do it for you. And so we've seen a lot of things today. We've seen that many people opt out of following Christ because it's less popular. Many opt out of following Christ because there are other things that attract their attention, other works of amazement they want to flock to. And we also see that many people opt out because they choose a life of convenience. And following Jesus just requires too much intentionality and too much effort. And Jesus, in this portion, he challenges his disciples to examine themselves. Examine themselves really carefully and think about their commitment to him. Because someday they will be called into an eternal account for the way in which they lived here on this life. So I want to ask you, is your life built on a solid foundation? Is your life on a foundation that is truly going to last for the long haul? Or is it one that's going to have catastrophic consequences? Because amazement is not the same as acceptance. We have to make a choice. Will we choose to follow Jesus, or will we choose to follow something else? Because following Jesus is not for the faint of heart, and it's the only way to experience a full and a lasting life. So at the beginning of this, we talked about a couple of towers, and we had those pictures on the screen of ones that were leaning and falling because they were on a shifting foundation. And those buildings, they led to catastrophic consequences, all because they weren't built on a solid foundation. But a foundation that lasts, it's one that is truly built upon Christ.